Hello everyone, and welcome to the second episode of Analyzing Benevolence, featuring the Undertale and Deltarune character Gerson Boom. Now, to those who have stuck around since the preamble video, you might be remembering that this was originally going to be a Ralsei video. So, what happened? Well, I still do want to do a Deltarune video due to my interest in the game right now, as well as it currently being super popular on YouTube. However, while there is enough on Ralsei to make a video on him as of right now, I still did have my doubts on whether I should still wait for Chapter 5 to come out at least, even if I did say it would be a little bit more time until the update video would come out. So I thought, why not focus on the character whose arc is completed? Now, there might be some information we learn about him later that'll change how we see him, and if there is, then I might make an update video. However, from where we are right now, I'm pretty comfortable with the sentiment that we've pretty much seen everything there is to Gerson Boom. Still, regardless, even if there is less to work off with him compared to a character like Ralsei, that doesn't mean that he doesn't add a lot of depth to Deltarune's story. And this has undeniably earned him a place in the hearts of thousands of players of the game, as well as justification for any praise he receives. So, without further ado, let's begin. While Gerson Boom became popular in the Toby Fox fandom due to his appearance in Deltarune Chapter 4, technically his first appearance was almost 10 years ago back at Undertale, with not as much fanfare. This isn't to say that he was forgotten or even not talked about, as you can still find YouTube videos about him before Chapter 4 came out. However, in a game full of weird and strange characters with extremely distinct personalities, it's hard to stand out even if your character is intriguing. So what's he like in the initial game that he appears in? Well, he has pretty much every single trait that he does in Deltarune, only much less obvious than they appear later on. Because of this, I am almost willing to call him pretty much the exact same character as his Deltarune counterpart. And while I was going to initially make a section dedicated to how different the two are from one another, I honestly can't really do that here. Of course, while there are some obvious differences such as his general occupation and place within the timeline, it's not really enough to justify making an entire section dedicated to it due to some Undertale characters being even more drastically different than their Deltarune counterparts compared to Gerson's changes. Honestly, when I really think about it, I think his most extreme change is probably just his design. So, everything that he says in Undertale will more or less just be explained in the sections talking about his general traits, starting with one of the first characteristics one can note about him is his immense interest in history. In Undertale, this is clear with his clothing representing that of an archetypal archaeologist, but also he flat out does say he studies history, and that it becomes easier when you've lived for so long. This fact of him being interested in history is also very essential to Undertale lore actually, as we learn many things about the universe they live in due to what he shares, and even what the Deltarune seemingly represents in the Undertale universe compared to the Deltarune universe. This fact about the Deltarune is especially interesting from a lore standpoint, as while in the Deltarune universe it's made very clear that it's meant to be a representation of the three heroes and their destiny to save the world from the Titan, in the Undertale universe it's not even really clear what the symbol represents. Gerson himself states that the triangles represent the monsters. However, he says that the angel-like figure is unknown in its meaning, either representing someone who will save all monsters from their fate in the underground, or someone who is an angel of death, with him just thinking it's a neat circle. Obviously, this bit of dialogue is meant to represent the player, and how anything they do will impact the story, regardless on if it's to save them, bring death, or just be a little fella. When considering the context of how the Deltarune is in Deltarune, this asks the question of why this is so different. Now, you might be wondering why this matters. Well, that's because there are three hypothetical answers to this question, at least in my opinion. The first one is simply that the Deltarune was created for an entirely different purpose, and that it's just a case of the universe being that different. The second one is that its purpose was simply lost to time, as even Gerson kind of admits that a lot of it has lost meaning, and while the original intent was to prophesize the rise of the Titans and the three heroes, it simply ceased to matter due to the human and monster war happening. The third one is that Gerson Boom straight up lied about this. I have my reasons for why I consider the third option, however this is something I want to get more in depth about later. Speaking about Deltarune though, his love for history is much more prevalent in this game, as even before his appearance in Chapter 4, many references can be found throughout the town of both his writings as well as his teachings. It also seems that he is somewhat of a Renaissance man to some degree due to many talents being mentioned such as smithing, fiction writing, non-fiction writing, teaching, awareness of dream recollection, and that's not even to mention the massive study filled with possibly hundreds of different subjects. The most famous of his endeavors, however, are the Lord of the Hammer books, a series of books he apparently wrote for his own children before he eventually published them as a award-winning series. In fact, these books seem to have become so famous that it's stated that Dragon Blazers, a well-known RPG, was loosely based on them. The Lord of the Hammer series in particular is really interesting because it very closely represents a fictionalized version of the prophecy told about the three heroes. But despite his seeming admiration for the prophecy due to his writings, his relationship to it seems to be significantly more complex, as throughout Chapter 4, he is constantly destroying the glass murals of the prophecy, and talks of defying fate throughout his role in Deltarune, and even to some degree Undertale. Despite his love for history, he seems to take a route that nothing is ever set in stone, and that history changes depending on the people who define it, rather than it being definitive and destined to happen, much like how Rousai believes the prophecy to be concrete, even if part of him doesn't want to believe that it is. Which leads me to my next point, and how Gerson Boom goes about showing off this point to others, and how he interacts with pretty much everyone in Deltarune and arguably Undertale, that being through deception and charisma. While deceptiveness is generally considered a negative trait for people, and you can still argue it may be his biggest flaw, he uses it for reasons that you can't really argue against. In Undertale, his deception is significantly more subtle. Some may not even notice this deception, but I think it still is an important part of his character in the original game. One example of this is just how much information he actually decides to share with you depending on the route. In the neutral run, he gives you a fair amount of information, not too much, but still a fair amount, while also hinting at some things that he has supposedly forgotten. However, in the pacifist run, when you go back after completing everything and talk to him, he gives you significantly more information, including things he seemingly remembered. This seems to be the primary tactic that he uses in both Undertale as well as Deltarune. Feigning ignorance is just a simple old man despite his capability of being so much more. While it could well be that he just forgot this information, I personally doubt it, as during the genocide route he practically gives you zero information about himself besides what he can say that will taunt and mock the player, including a mention that you as the player can't actually attack him, which is true due to his status as a vendor. This especially gives a huge perspective on just how clever he is, as many characters in Undertale break the fourth wall to some degree, but very few have an understanding of the rules to explicitly take advantage of the player like this. This understanding of the fourth wall is also part of the reason why I think Gerson decides to share so little information with the player until they know that they are trustworthy, as well as his interpretation of the prophecy and how he sees it, due to the possibility of the player either being a savior or a demon, even if Gerson himself seems to prefer the possibility of them being a savior. However, that also brings me back to the idea that I had that Gerson was flat out lying about the prophecy due to his deceptive nature. Why I think that this is a possibility is because of the fact that Gerson has shown in Deltarune his reluctance to believe in the nature of fate and prophecies, but he still seems to go on with the basis of this prophecy due to how he treats you in respective runs. So I think the reason why he said this was to inspire the player to try and be more aware of their actions, think of themselves as both a possible angel as well as a demon, and with him seemingly believing the player as well as even warning them about Undyne. I believe that Gerson told the player this under the pretense that they will pick the side of righteousness and bring peace to the underground. So overall, on this front, he has 3 reasons for his deceptiveness in Undertale. 1. To inspire the player to try and do greater things and to be a better person. 2. To keep valuable information away from the player and protect others just in case they are a threat, or just flat out confirmed to be one like in the genocide route. And 3, well, because he thinks it's funny. As for his appearance in Deltarune, however, his deceitfulness is similar. He relies very heavily on the tactic of pretending to just be a harmless old man, like he does in Undertale, often using it as a way to lead either Chris or Susie to realizing or achieving something, such as dropping his cane to help you dodge bullets, losing sense of direction to help you explore the area, or just asking Susie to heal him for mundane reasons, only to have her heal Jackenstein instead by accident. In fact, one of his most famous lines is a flavor text he gives in which you select him in the act menu that just says, "I'm a..." Fucking hell. So of course you know he takes his old man persona very seriously. For real though, this isn't the only tactic he uses, as Deltarune shows a different side to him, his incredible empathy. The first sign of this is his ability to understand how Susie is feeling with her healing powers, and his ability to comfort her with how to deal with them and get better. While this may not be the most glamorous display, I think it's still worth noting due to Ralsei's lack of ability to notice this, despite the game demonstrating that he is often incredibly good at comforting others and emphasizing with them. The other sign is when Gerson talks to Chris about their life issues in the weird route, realizing something is clearly wrong despite them not saying anything to indicate it, and basing it purely off of tone and expression. While Gerson's words and advice likely won't help Chris in the long run due to just how severe their problems are, he is still one of the few people to genuinely notice the change in Chris's demeanor outside of simply the player's control, and actually offer consolation. And this is just within the period of the two meeting for the first time. With this ability to read people as well as his deceitfulness, Gerson has multiple points in Deltarune that he tries to get across using these skills. However, his main point he's trying to make throughout Chapter 4 is that people can write their own stories, and that each person has their own skills they can add to the table and improve on. This is something that all three main characters struggle with in the game throughout their arcs. Chris has a struggle with being controlled by us as the player, something made even worse if we were trying to do the weird route. Susie has a deeply buried self-conscious nature that she tries to hide from others and herself, as well as possibly something bad that may happen to her due to the prophecy. Ralsei is cursed with the knowledge of what is supposedly going to occur within the prophecy, and genuinely believes that whatever awful thing is said to happen will happen, and has to pretend that everything will be okay. While Gerson has stated he's not exactly someone who believes in heroes, he believes that there will always be someone who decides to try and do the right thing. No matter what evils lurk, there will always be a counteract to it, regardless on prophecy interference or no. Speaking of heroes, however, while it can be stated that Gerson himself is a hero due to how he treats others and makes them see better in themselves, I think it's also good to consider the literal definition, one who always faces difficulty and overcomes it using bravery and courage. With this in mind, even if Gerson somehow didn't have an amazing moral compass, he'd always be known as a hero. A hero known as... In the Undertale genocide route, when asking about a hero, he states that he isn't one. However, this is a mix of him both being humble as well as lying, as we see in his pacifist run dialogue that he actually did used to be known as a hero, called the Hammer of Justice. We don't learn too much about his past with this, however it's hinted that perhaps he used to be one of the royal guards for Asgore due to Gerson talking about him in his past. We also learned that Gerson Boom was actually the mentor and major inspiration for Undyne, one of the current royal guards who undeniably deserves a video on a later date. However, she is incredibly tenacious and brave, to the point where she is one of the only monsters in the Undertale universe who is able to properly use determination as a way to fight you in the genocide route. So no doubt Gerson must have been something of a legend back in the day if he was able to give such inspiration. He also shows incredible bravery and heroism even when he's only talking to you in the genocide route, as he admits to you that, after you've probably gotten far enough in the conversation, the main reason he's talking to you despite you being known as a murderous serial killer is because he can give others more time to escape. Sure, he can't actually be hurt by the player as he previously stated, but I honestly think he would have risked it regardless of whether he knew or not, because that's just how brave he seems. And not only this, but he mocks you in the process as well, testing to see if you can actually do anything. Regardless on what is implied about him in Undertale, we don't truly get to see him in action until Deltarune. While Gerson wasn't a hero in the literal sense while he lived, due to the timeline differences of the universe, he still has what is seemingly his heroic form in the Dark World, likely a metaphor for what he represented. But we'll get to that later. Either way, it's become something of a meme with how strong Gerson Boom is in this world. Being able to effortlessly spare enemies, knowing where exactly Chris needs to dodge bullets in fights, being able to simply casually fight Susie and challenge her despite it just being a sparring match, and being the sole reason as to why the three heroes were able to defeat the Titan in the end of Chapter 4. Of course, if he wasn't a warrior or hero in his own world, then why does he have so much power in the Dark World? Why is he able to achieve all these great things if he was just a simple blacksmith turned historian turned writer turned teacher? Well, it's simple, because he left an impact. What the secret bosses and the shadow crystals represent exactly remain a mystery. However, there have been some very common elements between them. Before Chapter 3 and 4, it was simply that they were incredibly strong, persuaded by some dark force, and represented the feeling of feeling trapped. While the aspect of them being persuaded is likely no longer relevant, though we'll see if that changes, the intense strength and the feelings of being trapped are still prevalent. However, the latter has since manifested in a less literal way than people thought it would. If anything, I'd argue that it's more so a representation of feeling trapped by fate and destiny, rather than just feeling trapped. Jevil is fighting his destiny of forever feeling alone and being a perpetual boredom. Spamton is fighting his destiny of forever staying as a forgotten has-been who is in control by fate. The Knight, well, it's unclear if the Knight is fighting anything yet. However, the battle itself represents trying to fight a predetermined battle, getting an outcome from a fight that you are literally scripted to fail, only to somehow succeed. Gerson, though, much like how the Knight isn't fighting his own battle, he represents the heroes fighting their own destiny, with how Gerson is teaching the three that the prophecy is more so subjective, and that you can make your own stories and destiny with what you have. Now, I think that there's also a third thing that is common between all of these secret bosses, and what I believe to be the source of how each secret boss is so powerful. What I believe each secret boss has in common is that they represent a deep source of meaning to the light world. Jevil is a Joker card, thus being the most powerful and notable of the playing cards and having the most subjective meaning in that sense. The Knight, while unclear exactly what they are, still has an undeniable amount of meaning to both the light world as well as the dark world due to the creation of so many dark worlds. And with Spamton, well, okay, I do have an explanation and theory on how Spamton, or specifically Spamton NEO, connects to this, but if this is a side tangent, there's a lot of theorizing, so if you don't really care, skip to this point of the video. Anyway, so even though Spamton represents nostalgia for old internet scams, he isn't powerful by himself in his base form. He only really gets his power once he gains access to the Neo suit. Now obviously the Neo suit is a reference to Mettaton Neo in Undertale, but it's not exactly made clear why it's here. My own personal theory is that the Neo suit comes from a room that the Queen made specifically for Mettaton if she were to ever take over the world, as she did design rooms for each of the heroes based on their internet searches. And due to Mettaton's more depressive nature in the Deltarune universe, secluded attitude, and seeming lack of robot body, he likely spent a lot of time on the internet searching and talking about his own personal goals and ideal body he wanted. Thus the Queen created the Neo suit specifically for Mettaton based on his sheer idealist wishes for when she does take over the world and lead everyone to their ideal worlds. The suit in particular being heavily powered by Mettaton's sheer wishes for a new body. I also think this explains why there are still strings attached to the suit, as the Queen still is a tyrant despite her nature. So, with the nature of this idealization of this suit, plus Spamton's abstract ambitions and depressive nature and nostalgia for a better and older time, it's created a mixture of the two ideas that combine it to create the powerful Spamton NEO, a representation of pure ambition and idealization for something better. Anyway, that's enough of the funny trans robot and homeless guy. Time to go back to the old turtle.
Monkey.
As for Gerson Boom, his impact that he's left on the world is undeniable. But in order to really understand the impact he's left, we have to ask, who was Gerson Boom? On a larger scale, he was a man who wrote a book series that has inspired millions of different readers and even players with his writing, and inspired video game series that was loosely adapted from it. On a historic scale, he's a man who likely made amazing revelations and theories about the history of the world in this field. On a local scale, he's likely inspired tens if not hundreds of students to learn more about the world due to his teaching. And in Undertale, was even able to train one of the greatest heroes of all time. On a personal level, he's raised his son to be a kind and caring man who he molded to try and be independent and seek his own path and destiny, and never saw him as simply an extension of himself. And while he seemingly made a few mistakes along the way, he always cared about him regardless on circumstance. On a scale beyond death, he was a man who was able to reach someone through what is essentially the afterlife, inspire her to strive the best that she can be despite everything and everyone telling her otherwise, and was even able to properly make amends with his own son after not being able to say what he truly wanted for years. So, with all this in mind, and how he left the world when he died, all we can say is that Gerson Boom was a man who made the world a better place than how he left it. A man who believed everyone had the opportunity to decide their own destiny and place in the universe. A man who loved knowledge and the pursuit of it, and a man who, regardless on when and where he was a hero. Thank you to everyone who's still watching. It means a million that you're still around by the end of this video. And please, if you enjoyed the video, give it a like, or subscribe, and possibly share if it doesn't bother. I don't know, that's up to you though. Feel free to leave a comment on who you want to see next, whether it's a character from Undertale or Deltarune, or just someone else entirely. And, as always, have a good day.
Wonder, you should title your Deltarune video, "Why Deltarune Sucks, No Cap on God, for real. And if anybody asks why, tell them the Violife told you to do it. Good excuse.